Hello and welcome to another video. 1 year ago, I released an updated world record in Automobilista 1. This video is going to document a whole year's worth of work, how I went from a simple mod to making the fastest car in the physics engine. It's a topic that I've wanted to cover for a long time, haven't gotten around to doing it. Without further ado, let's begin. Before I get into the HTV file, I do have to quickly mention one of the big assists to this whole project, and that was Niels' go-kart mod. Because that go-kart was very fast, and its size was quite small and its weight was quite small, I was able to copy-paste shamelessly those files and those data points into my files, and I was able to apply them there. So thank you, Niels, for that go-kart mod. Now, to begin, the HTV file has mass. Mass is very important as it has as it is a big key factor to the speed that your car will reach. So if your mass is really high, your car will not go as quickly as a lighter car. At a certain point in AMS in this game, the car will float into the sky if your mass is too low. If your mass is too high, your mass is too high. But if your mass is 5 or 1 kilogram, this is in kilograms, if it's 5 or 1 kilograms, it will start floating. And so 200 was a reasonable point, which I picked for this car. So I settled with 200. The next point of note is the center of gravity height. Center of gravity is essentially the center. How do I explain center of gravity? Here's a definition on the screen of center of gravity. The lower your center of gravity is, the more stable you are. So if you are very close to the ground with a very wide base, your center of gravity is very low. It's not easy for you to be knocked over. That's what I did with this car. As you can see, the value is extremely small. It's near zero. You can't have it be zero because then the game will crash and the car will not load. Or the track will not load at all. Nothing will happen. It has to be very small. I could have made it smaller, but at that point, it's not really worth making it any smaller. It's such a small number already. So I made it very small, very low, in order to make the car as stable as possible at any speed. You may be wondering, where is the center of gravity reference to? Like what's the reference point or reference plane? I don't remember, to be completely honest. I have no recollection of where that is. I don't think it's the under tray parameters, because these are also relative to somewhere. So I don't remember. It might be somewhere, but I don't remember. Now, tires. We will get to tires shortly after the HTV file. AI, don't need that. Feelers. So as far as I can remember, feelers are your hitbox of the car. So outside of the car, there's an imaginary invisible rectangle, a rectangular prism, which the car is inside. So if that rectangle hits something, then the game knows that the car has hit something. One hitbox has hit another hitbox. So when you boil down AMS, when you boil down Automobilista, it's just a bunch of hitboxes moving around. That's all it is. And then you have the models, the way the car actually looks inside those hitboxes. And so that's what the feelers are. Now, front wing, sometimes called a lip or a splitter, but here it's front wing. The front wing is what assists with downforce at the front. Downforce is what pushes the car down at speed. The faster you go, the more downforce you'll have if you're looking to get downforce. You might get lift, which is the opposite of downforce, or technically downforce is the opposite of lift. It's normally called negative lift, but it's instead of upforce, it's downforce. And so one or a couple important factors in the front wing is the drag parameters and the lift parameters. So the drag parameters, I have them all as 0 because I don't want any drag on the car. Drag is what slows you down. And so I don't want the front wing to cause the car to slow down at all. The only thing I want the front wing to do is to push the car down. I want it to increase the downforce of the car so that my stability and my handling is increased. Formula 1 cars have high downforce. The higher your downforce is, the faster you can take corners, because your car is more planted to the road. That's really how I'll boil it down. Lift height and sideways, it kept 0. I don't want anything to do with lift. Left, right, up, down, aft, and fore, and rotation I kept as 0. I don't want any forces. When I don't want the front wing to affect the car in any way except downforce. All of these are when the car experiences left force or right force or up or down force. Downforce not being the downforce that comes from the wing, but when the car goes downwards. Or the car moving backwards for aft, or forwards for fore, or when it spins for rotation in either direction. What forces will it feel? Nothing. I don't want it to feel anything. Now, rotation is important because if you lose control of the car, what's the front wing going to do? I don't want it to do anything. Now, this is not a track weapon. I am not looking for the fastest lap times. I'm looking for the fastest top speed in a straight line. And so that's why rotation, I didn't really try and make it a track weapon here. It's the same thing for the rear wing. You can see no drag, and you can see lift. You can see lift as well. And it's the same thing here, except for left and right. Now, for the rear wing, I wanted, because the rear wing is commonly the more important of the two wings, the front and rear, because the rear wing is more important between the two, I wanted to have the left and right forces do a bit of, add in a bit of downforce as well. Body aero. This is where we get to the aerodynamics of the car aside from the front and rear wings. Body drag base, 0, no drag. No drafting. I don't need drafting. Drafting is also called slipstreaming. It's when you're behind another car, your speed will increase because the car in front punches a hole in the air, which reduces your drag. Body left and body right, I wanted negative, but not huge values. And here are the huge values: body up and body down. When the body experiences a force upwards, it will experience a force downwards as a result of that upwards force. And when the car experiences a force downwards, it will experience a force upwards to the car. So remember that there's a signal chain, or a sequence of experiencing of forces. And so remember that all these forces are when the car experiences that force external to it, outside of it, then it will react in this way. It will react in moving the other way, or it will react in, or really it will react moving the other way. So yeah, that's those were the settings that I put for the body aero. For left, right, up, and down. Aft and fore I kept at 0, and rotation and center I kept at 0. Now, vehicle width is an important value here. Because the coefficient of drag, which really is the be-all and end-all number for how much drag a car has, because the coefficient of drag is calculated by the front surface area. So let's say you were to look at a car dead on, and its surface area is huge. It's like a truck. Then its coefficient of drag will be higher. But if it's really, really tiny, if it's like a smart car, then its coefficient of drag will be lower because of the front surface area being smaller. So the smaller your car is, the lower your coefficient of drag will be, which means that your car will experience less resistive forces as it speeds up. Again, drag increases exponentially as you speed up. So if you're going 20 kilometers an hour, you will feel a lot more when you're going 60 kilometers an hour. You'll feel a lot more when you're going 600, and a lot more when you're going 6,000 kilometers an hour. For a car like this, the drag has to be as minimal as possible in order to reach that really high speed. It has to not have, it's like driving in a vacuum. There's no air resistance because there is no air. Now, one important thing to note is that the model of the car, the way it looks, the curves and the body panels and all that, the model of the car has nothing to do with the physics of the car. The car can look however it wants. It can look like a brick, but it can go Mach 10 because the physics is separate from the model. So here the vehicle width is very, very tiny. I had to fool the game, or manipulate the game, into thinking that the car was very, very narrow. which means it's not very tall either. So I had to manipulate that so that the coefficient of drag would be very low in the in-game calculations, in order for the game to be like, okay, that makes sense. It's super small, so I'm gonna let it go. I'm gonna let it go quickly. So that's how that worked. Suspension. At some point during the process, over the many months of working on this, I found values that worked, and I copy pasted them, and it just worked. It's the same thing for the third spring. Controls, I don't believe I touched these too much. Engine, we will get to the engine after the HDV file. Driveline, that's all your transmission stuff, so your clutch and your gears, and your shifting between those gears. The torque and the balk torque, I found that the bigger the number, the better. It worked a lot better. Delay and clutch time, and so these are all times, as far as I can tell. These are all times. I wanted the shifts between the gears to be as short as possible. Obviously, I'm not going to waste time shifting gears and then losing power and losing speed. I wanted the car to be four-wheel drive. Four-wheel drive because it's cool, and you can have acceleration on all four tires rather than just the rear ones or the front ones. I don't want understeer with the front tires. I don't want oversteer with the rear tires. I wanted four-wheel drive, keep it planted, keep it going. Very, very arbitrary reasons, but four-wheel drive is cool. And it's a four-wheel drive Supra. You never see that. Upshifts and downshifts and delays, I tuned those eventually. Now, gear file, we will get to the gears eventually. Allow gearing changes and allow final drive changes. These settings were so that in the game you can change the gearing of the car, so that you can stretch it out so that it can be really, really long gears, or you can make it really short, really quick gears, which reduces your top speed. Really long gears increases your top speed. Reverse setting, I think that means it doesn't have reverse, maybe. Forward gears 8, so this is an 8-gear car. But we'll get to the gears more in depth afterwards. The next four are front left, front right, and rear left and rear right. These are suspension settings, which are outside of the suspension file. The only thing to say about these, because I hate suspension, the only thing to say about these is the car needed to be really stiff in order to not be pushed into the ground when it goes at really high speeds. And also, because the track, and I'll talk about the track design soon, because the track didn't really have any bumps, it was okay. But I didn't want the suspension to be bouncing around a lot, even at high speeds. And when the car gets pushed down because of the downforce, I don't want the... it would make sense for it to have soft suspension, but that would mean that at times it would lose grip if it has really soft suspension. So I wanted really stiff suspension, just to keep it as stable as possible, especially at high speeds. Now the final thing is DRS. DRS stands for drag reduction system. It's a feature that's in Formula 1. What it allows is for the rear wing of the car to open. Now, the reason why I had DRS for this car was because at a certain speed, the downforce would be too much for it to continue speeding up. And so the DRS would alleviate some of that downforce so that it can continue speeding up. What I didn't include was an animation and a change in the model when the rear wing would open, because the rear wing doesn't open and it would have been too much work. And I don't know how to do it. And so I kept it as is. I just included that, so it gave the car a bit of lift while the DRS was active, so that it wouldn't be pushed into the ground all the time, because when you get pushed into the ground and then you fall underneath the map, you get respawned at the start. You don't want to go into the void. Okay, time for the engine. This was a very, very fun part of making this car. As you can see, there's a whole bunch of numbers with RPM torque at the start of every line. And at the top, it says AE86N1 spec. What is AE86N1 spec? One of the cars that I worked on in this series was a Toyota AE86N1 spec. And so I figured out that, hey, that car has really good engine settings, a really good torque curve. So I just copy pasted the whole thing. I did not bother to change the name because it does not matter what the name is. this engine file will work regardless. Now, with each of these lines, there are 3 values. There's RPM, there is this massive negative value, which I don't remember what it is, and then there is torque. Now, notice how there's no horsepower. There's no horsepower here because you can calculate horsepower from torque and RPM. These numbers were generated in a program called Physics Editor. Now, what is a torque curve? To do this, I have to find my whiteboard. I found my whiteboard, which is not actually white, and I've realized I don't need to be wearing headphones. I don't know why I was wearing them. What is a torque curve? So a torque curve has 2 axes. It's a graph with RPM on the bottom. We have torque on the y-axis. So as your RPM increases, your torque will increase as well. So a torque curve might look like that. And this will be your max RPM. Your torque will only go up to a certain point, to that maximum, and then it will start dropping. Because at that point, the engine is just working to produce nothing. Now this torque curve is for 1 gear only. It doesn't change from gear to gear, but in order to find your maximum power, you want it in your highest gear. So here is what it looks like when a car goes on a dyno. A dyno essentially measures a torque curve. And so as you can see, this is a finalized torque curve. But you can see 2 lines there. Those 2 lines are horsepower and torque. Now with this application, with this car, the torque curve was very, very steep. But it was quite long as well. It was quite long because the max RPM was 23,000. The torque of this car, it maxed out at 45,797. The physics editor would generate, I'm pretty sure you could put in which increments you wanted. So this would generate in increments of 250. And so every 250 RPM, it will give you a torque value. And so you just copy paste that into here, and so that's your torque curve. It's a very analog way of making a torque curve. Rev limit range. So the rev limit, the RPM limit, I capped it at 21,750, which would be here before the torque goes into the negatives. Because when the torque goes into the negatives, that's bad. You don't want that. What would happen when the torque would go into the negatives? I don't remember. To be completely honest, I don't remember. Boost comes from a turbocharger or a supercharger, or if you have both of them in the same car, it's a twin charge car. Essentially, to boil it down really quickly, a turbocharger uses the exhaust gases from the car, from the combustion cycle, to put more air into the engine, which will increase your power. The more exhaust gases you have, the more air goes into the engine. The setting here was 100% more horsepower per setting. So I think I gave it 100% more horsepower. So it would have been a 100,000 horsepower car. That's the engine file. The engine file was really fun to work on. I think in one of my videos, I mentioned that I went to 350 million horsepower. At that point, the tires are doing nothing and it's somewhat pointless. So no need to go to power that high unless your tires can take it. And speaking of tires, it is time to go to the tire file, the TBC file. Now tires have this cool thing called a slip curve, which I still don't understand. Or I don't understand now after trying to read up on it and trying to make sense of it. The slip curve I copy pasted from Niels's go-kart. So I don't remember how slip curves work. I hated slip curves because you can't calculate them. Like, you don't have a physics editor kind of program software like with the torque curve. You have to actually put in the individual values. I don't like that. It's too much work. I have to understand it. What was fun though was the compound. So glue year it's a play on words of good year. And that's what Niels named his go-kart tires. And I essentially copy pasted that. Radius. And actually I have to go back to the reminder that the model has nothing to do with the physics. So the tires can look completely different than the physics here in the tire file. So the radius, that is the radius of the tire. It's half the diameter of the tire. Your width, now your radius, the radius here is quite small relative to the width. You want more width than radius if you want more grip. And so you might look at a Formula One car. They have really, really wide tires. You might compare that to a road car tire, which is very, very narrow, because you're not looking for maximum grip with a road car, but you are with a Formula One car. Okay, one of the last few files, or maybe the last one, is the gear ratio file. Gear ratio file is important because it basically determines what your top speed will be. If your gear ratio is too short, you will have, or if your final drive is too short, then you will have a short or a lower top speed. So think of gears here the same way as you would on a bike. It's the same concept. When you start from rest, from a standstill, you want to use a really low gear so that it's easy for you to actually get moving. Once you go fast enough and you can't go any faster in this gear, you want to upshift, and you want to keep repeating that pattern until you reach your top speed. And so that's the same way it works here. As you can see, it starts at 5, eventually it gets to 1, it reduces until 1, and then it gets to a decimal number. It's the same thing with these 8 gears. Now if we go down past all these double slashes to the final drive, that is actually, I think, the final thing to take a look at. The final drive essentially is the stretch of your gears. So, time for the whiteboard again. So this is what it would look like if you had a pretty standard final drive. All your gears are close together, and none of them give you a huge advantage over the other. So if your final drive were increased, more or less it would look like this. And this is only, what, 1, 2, 3, 4 gears. It would look like this, and so it will stretch and stretch and stretch. It will just continue on, which means that your speed will increase. Your top speed will increase. So if your final drive is really short, you'll end up like there. So your speed will be limited to there. But if your final drive is really long, then you'll end up there, like off screen completely. And so that's what I had to find out. I had to find a final drive value that was that would actually get me to that point without running out of road. Now, if your final drive is like way too long, it's going to take you forever to go from gear to gear to gear because it's so stretched out. But if your final drive is short, you won't reach your possible theoretical top speed. That's why you want your final drive to be extended as much as possible, but a reasonable amount. The last item I'll discuss is tracks. I made a 90-kilometer long track. How did I do this? Well, I googled the longest stretches of straight road in the world. I went to Google Maps. In Australia, I found this stretch of road, very, very long. I set a point-to-point route. I exported it as a map. I went into Bob's Track Builder. I imported it. I tweaked some settings. I exported it as a track. And then in AMS, when it loads, it takes at least 3 minutes to load the map. Which is not too long. I tried one which was over 120 kilometers long and it never loaded. So 90 was good. I loaded up, drove on the road, set the record. I don't know how I found this program, but it was the only one which actually worked in order to make a track, because I wasn't going to make a track from scratch. I was going to use someone else's tool. Just like with Niels' go-kart mod, and just like with a physics editor to make the torque curve. So that is how I made the Mark IV Supra go Mach 10 and beat the record, and then beat the record again. It took me a long time to do it, but it was very fun. I appreciate the help from the AMS community, from the AMS unofficial Discord, which I will link in the description down below, and actually from the Project Cars modding Discord, which I'll also link in the description. I started this project on Project Cars to try and see how quickly I could make a car go. What was the top speed? And quickly in Project Cars I figured out that the top speed was around 315 miles per hour, which was nothing. Sure, it was 315 miles an hour, which is really quick, but it was nothing. And then eventually I found AMS, I saw the record was 11,000 something, and I wanted to beat it. And eventually I did, and that is how I did it. So hopefully you liked this video. If you did, leave a like down below. If you're new to the channel, be sure to subscribe and leave a comment down below if you really want to. I hope to see you all soon, whenever that may be, but until then, we'll see you next time.